có chạy được. Ủa vậy hả? Gì vậy? Gì vậy? Tại chưa ăn. Ba ba.
This programming is sponsored by the University of Houston Law Center, with 4 programs ranked among the top 15 law school programs by U.S. News and World Report, including intellectual property law. More at law.uh.edu.
Within the Caribbean, you're between a rock and a hard place in terms of how does an island prepare for a Category 5 storm. Immense preparations went in at government levels, organizational levels, the levels of individuals. And when you see our southwestern parishes and the impact of this storm, you know, one has to wonder, how do small islands contend with stronger storms under a warmer climate? And this begs for and pushes the advocacy that is underway by small islands to say, listen, globally, we have to treat with more urgently our greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts of a warmer climate globally.
Haiti did not suffer a direct hit from Melissa, but its intense rains are linked to dozens of deaths or missing persons there.
And we have yet to get clarity about conditions in Cuba, where Melissa was still a major Category 3 storm when it hit a city of 500,000 people.
To learn more about the extreme nature of Hurricane Melissa, we called up Ryan Truchelet, chief meteorologist with the consulting firm Weather Tiger. He's based in Tallahassee, Florida. Ryan, welcome back to Living on Earth.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk.
So, what was your reaction to this incredibly strong storm?
It was a gobsmacking, head-spinning kind of a day to be a meteorologist. The number of records that Melissa sets, unfortunately, at landfall is extensive. It's going to take time to fully gather and process the data to truly understand Melissa's strength and intensity as it was making landfall. But, I mean, suffice to say, this was one of the very strongest storms anywhere in the Atlantic ever, and it was probably the very strongest to ever make landfall on any landmass bordering the Caribbean, the Gulf, or the Atlantic in recorded hurricane history.
Wow. What are some of the factors that helped fuel the strength of Hurricane Melissa?
Well, 2025, we've seen sea surface temperatures across the Atlantic Basin be warmer than average, not quite reaching the record levels that we set in 2023 and 2024, but quite clearly the third warmest temperatures on average across the Caribbean, going back to at least the 1970s and probably much longer than that as well. But not only were the surface waters of the Western and Central Caribbean 30 to 31 degrees Celsius, but those warm waters were extraordinarily deep as well. Waters above 30 degrees Celsius likely extended 65, 70, 75 meters below the surface. And that really mattered in this situation because Melissa was a slow mover. And usually when a hurricane stalls out over warm waters, it expends those waters. It basically evaporates the surface layers of the hot water. Water starts to be transported kind of really out away from the storm, and you start to upwell colder water to depth. Unfortunately, in this case, when Melissa started upwelling waters from beneath the surface, those waters were just as warm as the waters at the surface. So that is very unusual. Warm waters or deep warm waters cannot create a storm from nothing. You have to have a spark, you have to have an initial disturbance, you have to have favorable atmospheric conditions. You know, Melissa struggled for a few days last week. After it formed, it didn't really intensify for 3 or 4 days because the atmospheric conditions were not in place. But as soon as everything lined up in the atmosphere, its intensification was explosive and sustained all the way from Friday through landfall on Tuesday, unfortunately.
So if I understand you correctly, the hurricane is feeding off of this warm water at the surface, but then oftentimes we'll see these hurricanes actually dredge up cold water from below that actually slows them down. But that didn't happen in this case.
Right. It certainly moved slow enough that if there was colder water beneath the surface, it would have probably been a factor and resulted in the hurricane's intensity leveling out at some point in a way that just did not happen here.
So, Ryan, what do we know about how the climate crisis contributed to this particular storm?
Well, I think that it's fair to say that while there is a history of very intense storms forming in the western half of the Caribbean in the latter third of hurricane season, October and November, I do think in this case, it's really not possible for the waters of the Caribbean to be as warm as they were and as deep as they were minus climate change. Again, warm waters can't create a hurricane from nothing. The waters have been warm and they've been sitting there all year, and this is the first hurricane to develop and move over the Caribbean. But it's a loaded gun, and it loads the gun even more powerfully to have that potential energy waiting for the right spark. So maybe in a non-anthropogenic climate change kind of world, you know, perhaps you still get a Melissa. Does it claw its way down to 892 millibars and 185 or higher miles per hour sustained winds? Maybe not quite that intense. But certainly the region does have a history of devastating storms. And as in a lot of cases, climate change is kind of acting on the margins here to make bad events a little worse, or sometimes a lot worse.
Chào lấy hàng nè.
Absolutely. So, you know, as ocean temperatures
Okay.
continue to rise, what do you think the Caribbean region can expect in terms of future hurricanes?
Well, basically, if you look at the 2025 hurricane season, I think what we saw this year may actually be a pretty decent guide to the kind of changes in how hurricane activity may shift over the next few decades. You know, this hurricane season was forecast to be around average to somewhat above normal, but not hyperactive, not tremendously above normal. And now with Melissa happening, that's basically what we've seen. We've seen around 130 units of what's called accumulated cyclone energy. If you go back over the last 75 years, the average is about 105 to 110. If you look back over the past 30 years, we've averaged about 125, 130 ACE units. So it's either above normal based on long-term history or right around average for what we've seen over the past few decades. But we've only seen 13 named storms, which is actually somewhat fewer than we've seen on average over the past 30 years. The truly extraordinary thing about the 2025 hurricane season is that of those 13 named storms, 3 of them were Category 5 hurricanes. And that's the second most that we have ever reported in the Atlantic Basin. Second only to the 2005 hurricane season, where we had 28 named storms and 4 of them were Category 5s. So we were extraordinarily efficient, for lack of a better word, in converting weak tropical storms into Category 5 monster hurricanes.
Yeah, I mean, we may not be getting more hurricanes, but it sounds like the ones that we do get may be bigger and badder and stronger and have more of an impact.
There's certainly research that would suggest that, and now with the 2025 hurricane season going under our belts, I'd say there's a fair amount of observations to suggest that as well. That's what I'm talking about here, that It's really these mega events like Melissa that are really the most impactful, both in economic and certainly in human terms. So, it's very dangerous and frightening to be thinking about, what if 20% of the storms every hurricane season turn into category 4 or 5 storms? These kind of extreme events are well within the realm of possibility, and we need to build a society that's as resilient as possible to those risks.
Ryan Truschelet is chief meteorologist with the weather consulting firm Weather Tiger. Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan.
All right, thank you.
Coming up, we meet a salamander with a smile. That's ahead on Living on Earth. Stay tuned.
Support for Living on Earth comes from the estate of Rosamund Stone Zander, celebrated painter, environmentalist, and author of The Art of Possibility, who inspired others to see the profound interconnectedness of all living things and to act with courage and creativity on behalf of our planet. Support also comes from Sailors for the Sea and Oceana, helping boaters race clean, sail green, and protect the seas they love. More information at Sailors for the Sea.
This programming is sponsored by Collaborative for Children, advancing early education across Greater Houston by working with caregivers and communities so every child enters school ready to succeed. More at collabforchildren.org.
Open-minded discussions and debates about the issues affecting our lives. Everything from science and tech to politics, culture, and foreign policy. In our divided nation, we feel it's more important than ever for people to be open-minded, open to disagreement, and open to listening to the other side. Join me in being open to debate.
Sunday night at 10 p.m. on News 88.7.
It's Living on Earth. I'm Jenny Doring.
And I'm Steve Kerwood. Encouraged by U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas back in 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower created what is now called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's the largest national refuge in the U.S. and provides sanctuary for the abundant wildlife there, especially the porcupine caribou herd. They migrate in such great numbers that Anwar, as it's called, has been compared to the Serengeti in East Africa. But since the discovery of vast oil and gas deposits in the region in the late 1960s, the fossil fuel industry has set up shop and now operates a major oil field in Prudhoe Bay, the coast just west of Anwar. And for 40 years there has been pressure to drill in Anwar itself. The first Trump administration auctioned oil leases only to have them canceled by the Biden administration. And now the second Trump administration is again opening Anwar for oil leases, well, the current price of oil would make drilling uneconomical. On the front lines against drilling in Anwar are the native Alaskan Witchen. Joining us is Kristen Moreland, chair of the Witchen Steering Committee. Welcome to Living on Earth, Kristen.
Thank you for having me.
So, on the coastal plain there, where the Trump administration has decided to open up for drilling, sometimes I've heard you folks call it God's country. Explain that for me, please.
Our elders call our land Ilshikwasan Gwendai Goodley, which means the sacred place where life begins. We call it God's country because we don't see the things that you guys see anywhere else. We don't see road development. We don't see refineries. We don't smell the pollution. All we see is pristine land. Our Gwich'in communities, we live along the migration route in Canada and Alaska and have relied on the caribou for thousands of years. We use every part of the caribou. It has helped us sustain families and entire communities through harsh winters. Our winters get down to like 70 below. Our relationship is spiritual. The caribou we see it as a relative, not just a resource. Elders always told me that we are half of them and they are half of us. They carry half of our heart and we do theirs. The land and traditional knowledge, we follow the migration routes of the herd. We always had knowledge of our land, the weather. So we see the animal behavior and we know that there is climate change. We know that there's something wrong. We have been doing this for years and we'll continue it, hopefully, if drilling doesn't happen.
So, talk to me about your reaction to this recent decision by the federal government.
The action by the Trump administration is a direct attack on the Gwich'in. We have, for decades, been a voice for the caribou and stood against the destruction of the Arctic refuge. And when we heard this, we were just appalled. We didn't expect this decision. And it's just devastating to our people that they can just not care about human rights at all. They don't care about our people. They said that they talked to all the northern communities in Alaska and we're all okay with it. But not one Gwich'in community have they talked to. Not one. And we're the ones that are going to face the consequences of their actions.
To the west of where you are, what's going on with the caribou there? And how might that be related to oil and gas extraction?
So a study has showed mounting evidence that caribou in the North Slope oil field areas, even after generations, continue to stay away from man-made features like pipeline, roads, buildings, and show little sign of habitation to development, especially during the sensitive calving period. So we have seen, I think, like a 50% decline in the past 2 decades since oil development in the Western Arctic, including severe declines in several Alaska herds that have led to hunting restrictions and negative impacts on subsistence communities. So we hear stories from different villages in the Western Arctic, in Prudhoe Bay, around Prudhoe Bay, where there is no caribou. The elders are even posting on Facebook asking people for caribou bones because our people boil caribou soup bones, especially our elders. They love soup. So that is very disturbing to us because I can't imagine when our freezers can't be full anymore. I can't imagine not being able to bring a soup bone or anything to our elders because our elders mean so much to me and they need our meat. We need our meat to survive. We can't just go to the store and buy food there. It's not like down here. Like I'm in Fairbanks and there's grocery stores here where I could go and buy food. But by the time they make it to a village, like Arctic Village, where you have to fly 2 hours from Fairbanks to Arctic Village, you cannot drive up there. There's no road systems at all. So the freight costs us so much. I can't even tell you how much 1 pound of ground beef costs. It's like $40, $45 for 1 pound. And by the time it makes it up there, it doesn't look like meat. Like it's just really dark brown. When we get our meat fresh, it is perfect. There's no antibiotics. There's no nothing that they put in the food nowadays. We get from the land. And it's not like that in our Western communities right now. I can tell you that. All of the caribou herds they have declined majorly.
What does it feel like to have land that is sacred to you and your community being caught up in this political situation?
When we go out on the land and we hunt for our caribou, our men goes out there and hunt for our caribou. And they have such a big pride when they come back and we see racks on their four-wheeler or however they're bringing it back to us. Their smiles can just like tear you up because they're bringing home this meat to fill their freezers, to give to elders, to give to the community members. They are so proud, and we need that from our men because we don't live in the city, we don't have therapists on hand, we live off the land. So if that gets taken away from us, it will totally wipe us out as Wiccan people. If oil drilling happens in the coastal plain, that is what will happen to us as Wiccan people. We'll no longer be here. There is still hope because no major oil companies want to go up there because we have lawyers that are on ground working as we speak. We have many allies on our side that is helping us. So we have hope. That's hope to us. We know that there's so many people right now that is rooting for our land, that doesn't want drilling. We're going to continue fighting, and we're going to continue raising our voices and concerns and putting up a fight.
Kristen Moreland is Executive Director of the Wiccan Steering Committee. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
Thank you so much. Masicho.
The U.S. Department of Interior provided a statement about oil and gas extraction and the subsistence rights of Alaska Natives, and it's posted on our website, loe.org.
Now, serial killers may not be the type of topic you expect to hear about on Living on Earth. But hear us out, it'll all make sense in a moment.
Yes, from Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer to Charles Manson and the Zodiac Killer, serial killers are a distinctly American phenomenon. And Jenny, we have more serial killers in our history than the next 10 closest countries combined.
Oh, really? Yikes. I have heard, though, that within this country, there's kind of a hot spot for them.
Oh, yes, there is, or was anyway. And many of these serial killers were active in the 1970s in the Pacific Northwest. Seattle-born author Caroline Fraser offers one possible explanation in her new book, Murderland: Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. She theorizes that the neurotoxin lead is key to this story. And she links dangerously high lead exposure from smelters and gasoline to the increase of violence and murders in her home state. Caroline Fraser joins us now. Welcome to Living on Earth.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You know, in some respects, this is an autobiography, and you provide some rather intimate details of your life, like juggling two boyfriends.
Yeah, this book covers a period of time when I was much younger. It was the 1960s, 70s. And I really wanted to give readers who may not be familiar with that era a kind of flavor of what it was like to be a young person then, to be a young woman in particular, and what it was like growing up in an era when all these serial killings started happening.
So, of course, aside from your own story, this book is about serial killers and the neurotoxin lead, as well as questionable development and even geological damage. So how did the idea for Murderland first come about with all those elements?
Well, in the Northwest, where I'm from, of course, the question has always been raised year after year of why Seattle and the Northwest in particular seems to be kind of a hotspot for serial killers. And of course, the newspapers were very fond of this topic, and constantly were talking about what is it about this place? And people had all kinds of theories, it was the weather or the rain, or maybe it was just too gloomy a place, maybe it was the highway system. So I'm pointing at another kind of theory to address why this might have happened. And I also am hoping that no matter what you think of this theory, whether you agree or don't agree, you may learn something about the ecological history and the environmental damage that happened in this place over the past 100 years or so.
The book itself, I think, opens in your hometown of Seattle in the 60s. Just set the stage for us for a moment. What was going on in that time?
Yeah, Seattle has always had a very up and down, hot and cold economy. So the 1970s, for example, was a recession. A lot of contracts were canceled at Boeing. People weren't building as many houses. People were losing their jobs, and gasoline had become very scarce and expensive. So it was a troubled time nationally and regionally for Seattle. And that was the time when I was growing up there, and all these bizarre things started happening. The country nationally saw a real rise in violent crime, and so did the greater Seattle area.
Your book also links exposure to pollutants such as lead to the abnormally high level of crime, including serial killers in the Northwest. Let's focus for a moment on Ted Bundy, a famous serial killer. He grew up in the Tacoma area, not so many miles from where you grew. Talk us through the connection between Ted Bundy's exposure to lead and his rise as one of America's most infamous serial killers.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was 13, when he began this kind of spate of abductions and rapes and murders, nobody had really heard of the term serial killer. It's not that they hadn't existed. I mean, there have always been people like Jack the Ripper, for example, but the whole phenomenon of serial killers did not yet exist in the way that we know it now, both from the media, from Hollywood, from books, etc. So it was really kind of an unknown thing. Now, of course, everybody has heard of Ted Bundy, but one of the things I became really interested in was where he grew up, because he was born actually in Vermont, but then as a young child moved to Tacoma, Washington. And Tacoma had both a very high crime rate, and it also had a lead smelter. It was putting out large amounts of lead and arsenic particulates into the air throughout the whole period when Ted was growing up. And we now know, thanks to research and mapping that's been done, exactly how much lead was in Ted Bundy's front yard and his backyard. We know how much arsenic was there. So he was exposed to a significant amount of these toxins. Whether that contributed to what he ended up doing, we certainly can't know. We can't prove that. But it's an interesting fact, because he always seemed like somebody who didn't entirely seem to have developed in a normal way. Like many serial killers, he had fantasies of rape and murder from a very, very young age. So that was something that I was interested in looking at, especially when you see other acts of serial murder that are associated with that same area.
And by the way, Ted Bundy was born, as you write in your book, to an unwed mother. That mother had been exposed to lead as well, given her family's business.
Yeah, that's very true. Ted Bundy's mother grew up in Philadelphia, which has been called the city of smelters, because there was so much smelting activity going on there in the run-up to World War II and throughout World War II. And of course, Ted Bundy is born in 1946, just after the end of the war. There are several of these killers who I write about who really were exposed in multiple ways to lead throughout their lives, both as children and as adults. And I think it is a fair question to ask what that might have resulted in.
So talk to me about how the stories of the other serial killers are linked to Bundy, the geography, and the exposure to the neurotoxin lead.
Well, one of the other killers who I talk about is Gary Ridgway, who also grew up in the Seattle-Tacoma area, and as a child used to play, according to his brother, in piles of copper tailings, which are the leftover rocks from mining, which themselves contain significant amounts of the kind of toxins that you see coming out of smelters. He grew up near an airport at a time when a lot of general aviation aircraft were using leaded fuel. And as an adult, he worked painting the cabs of trucks, which was at the time using leaded paint. So he's exposed to lead throughout his entire life. And I think he makes a really interesting example of this kind of exposure. Another killer is Richard Ramirez, who grew up in El Paso, Texas, where the company that owned the smelter in Tacoma had another smelter. This was ASARCO, the American Smelting and Refining Company. So El Paso had been the recipient of the fallout from that smelter for many, many years. And Richard Ramirez, too, shows a lot of developmental difficulties as a child. Somebody who had seizures and developed a very, very kind of violent fantasy life as a kid, which then he acted upon some years later as a young man in Los Angeles. But I thought it was fascinating that although we know Richard Ramirez from what he did in LA, he really grew up in a completely different place and was exposed to lead.
So, talk to me about the gender connection here to serial killers. I think the numbers that you said is less than 8% are women, almost always men. Why do you think that is, and how might that be related to their exposure to lead in childhood and adulthood?
Yeah, there have been some studies on this that show that the development of the male brain is affected much more grievously, I think, than the development of the female brain in childhood if you're exposed to lead. The development of parts of the brain like the frontal cortex, where you have a lot of the parts of the brain that control impulsivity and aggression, and they've shown this through brain scans of people who've been exposed to lead, and the effects are much more notable in men than in women.
Let's talk for a moment about the Cincinnati lead studies. What were the findings of that research, and why are they still relatively unknown?
Yeah, that's a great question as to why they're not as widely known as they should be. But yes, the Cincinnati studies were a very long-term series of studies that looked at kids who were exposed to varying amounts of lead and then followed them until they became young adults. The findings, I think, fairly strongly showed a correlation between lead exposure in children and in pregnant women, and the behavior of these kids after they grew up in the teen years, in the early 20s, when most violent crime is committed. There was a real strong suggestion that lead was responsible to some extent for a rise in violent behavior, in impulsivity, in heightened aggression, in juvenile delinquency. So it's a very important series of studies. I'm not sure why it hasn't received as much attention as it should have, but I suspect a lot of that had to do with the ways in which the lead industry itself was dedicated to convincing people that lead was safe and that this was really merely a correlation, that it wasn't something that we should be concerned about. I mean, they were dedicated for years to covering up the actual information and studies that showed that lead is not safe and that there's no amount of lead that is safe in the human body.
So, what does the removal of lead from gasoline tell us about lead and violent crime?
Well, the fascinating thing about the correlation between leaded gas and violent crime is that you see a very sharp rise in violent crime in the 1970s. It was over 10 per 100,000 people. And we've never, in the records of the FBI, we had never reached that before. And that correlates with the post-World War II boom in people driving, which storms and commuting longer distances, there's more leaded gas entering the atmosphere. So, we talked about the Cincinnati studies that showed that children exposed to lead may develop heightened aggression 20 years later. So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing 1950s, the amount of leaded gas is really increasing in the atmosphere. Then when these kids become around the age of 20 in the 1970s, 2025, you see the rate of crime rising in the 70s and 80s and continuing through the early 90s. And what happens during that period is that, we have the Clean Air Act, we have the EPA being established, we have regulations that are beginning to come in to affect leaded gasoline. And then you see a very sharp drop-off beginning to happen with violent crime.
Just ahead, we'll continue our conversation with Caroline Fraser about her book Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. Stay tuned to Living on Earth.
Support for Living on Earth comes from the Waverly Street Foundation, working to cultivate a healing planet with community-led programs for better food, healthy farmlands, and smarter building, energy, and businesses.
Next time on Climate One, people who work in climate have come under personal attack by groups who don't like their work like promoting laws that would make polluters pay for damages.
Do you seem to have in mind that I am part of some green conspiracy type thing, and perhaps they're hoping to discredit me and discredit the laws by association?
When climate work comes at a cost, on the next Climate One.
Sunday morning at 6 on News 88.7.
I'm Stephen Dubner, host of Freakonomics Radio. Every week, Freakonomics Radio explores the hidden side of, well, everything from the economics of sleep to when is the best time to rob a bank. So tune in next time on Freakonomics Radio.
Freakonomics, Mondays at 9 p.m. on News 88.7.
It's Living on Earth. I'm Jenny Doring.
And I'm Steve Kerwin. Caroline Fraser's book Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers, has a deeper theme than a set of mere murder mysteries. A key part of her book considers how our society tends to ignore and deny the signs of major risks, such as lead exposure. So Murderland includes the story of the Olympic Lava Millennium or OWL, a geological fault line that runs through the Northwest. Caroline, you're right that the land on top of the OWL is prone to floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, and other disasters, and yet we build on it anyways. Please tell us about OWL and how it fits into your narrative.
Yeah, the owl is another image that I kind of fell in love with. It cropped up when a map maker, a cartographer, was drawing a map of Washington State. And this map was so detailed, and when he finished it, he kind of glanced across it and noticed that there seemed to be a kind of a trough that was created, sort of weird, visible line from the tip of northwestern Washington down through the state. And he wondered what that was. He thought it probably had something to do with an earthquake fault, which is, I think, the leading theory now. But I loved the image of it and the metaphor that it makes, because it suggests both the hazards of the natural world, earthquake faults, and the hazards that we put ourselves in by being drawn to the places where these hazards exist. I mean, we have now moved in such large numbers and in such density to places like Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles, where there are these earthquake faults. I think this is, again, a metaphor for what we do to ourselves, and both the beauty of the region and the dangers that it poses.
I think in geologic history there was a major kind of earthquake in that area, maybe some 300 years ago, that killed a lot of people.
Yes, in the 1700s, and you see fascinating records of this in Native American culture, in stories, in art and memory. And that's just a kind of fascinating record of what we're up against, because they believe that those fault lines and the Juan de Fuca plate that is being forced under the continent of North America, that's going to cause another major earthquake of that same strength anytime now or in the future. And that's quite alarming, given that now there are so many more people and bridges and tunnels and skyscrapers and all of the things we bring along with us.
And you don't live in the Seattle area any longer.
No, I don't.
So there seems to be a theme of scientific denial throughout this story. The proximity of danger caused by this owl fault line and the smelters is just largely ignored by the public. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I don't think we're very good at planning far into the future, even when we know about things like the earthquake fault. I mean, we now know so much more about that history than we did even 20, 30 years ago. But we still have a very hard time preparing for things like that. I mean, you see this in the government preparations for pandemics and so forth. It's very hard to get people to invest money and time in things that don't seem to be an immediate problem. And I think people just don't like to think about it. They don't like to think about the ramifications of what might happen, what could be waiting for us. So I think as human beings, we just come with some inherent limitations, that keep us from doing things that are in our best interests. But obviously there are enormous stakes too, financially. I mean, for decades it was very hard to get the smelter companies, for example, to deal with anything that they were putting into the air. They didn't even want to release any of the information they had. The system is really broken, I think, in terms of we just wait until these corporations have done the worst that they can do, and only then do we go after them to clean it up. So I think until we develop some kind of system that puts the onus on the corporations to begin with, we're really just going to always be behind the eight ball.
Some would say that applies to the climate emergency as well.
Absolutely. If you look at what Exxon and Standard Oil and so many of these corporations have done, they knew about this. They knew about it for decades and lied about it, which is exactly what the smelters did. So when you're trapped in that kind of reality, I think you have to ask yourself, do we need to really reform the system from the ground up? And we do, but it's increasingly difficult to see how to make those kinds of changes.
And before you go, to what extent does this book scratch the itch that you had going back many, many years when you were living in a community where there was a lot of fear about serial killers?
Yeah, I think that it was an enormously sort of fascinating thing for me to be able to confront some of these stories, some of these theories, and try to make some sense out of it. Whether, you believe the theory or not, I think there's a whole history of environmental damage that was perpetrated on the Northwest, a place that I love dearly, and on many other places around the American West and in the United States during that era. And the history is important, whether you care about the serial killer angle or not. It's a really troubling and important history that I think if we understand it, it might help us make better decisions in the future.
Caroline Fraser's book is titled Murderland: Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. Thanks so much for taking the time with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great conversation.
stores are brimming with gifts for departed loved ones. But first, this note on emerging science about an amphibian endemic to Mexico, with a bit of a cult following.
Axolotls are aquatic salamanders with feathery gills that look like they're always smiling. These amphibians are endemic to just one lake in Mexico. There are lots of axolotls in captivity as pets or research animals, but there are estimated to be only 50 to 1,000 of the endangered salamanders left in the wild. But conservation biologists recently reported that releasing axolotls that were bred in captivity into restored and man-made wetlands may help to bolster their populations. A team led by Alejandro Ramos, a scientist at the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California in Ensenada, Mexico, released 18 captive-bred axolotls with implanted radio transmitters into 2 wetlands in Mexico City. One group was released into a restored canal in the axolotl's native habitat, Lake Xochimilco, and the other into a pond in an artificial wetland. Researchers then tracked the aquatic salamanders for 40 days. The scientists reported that all of the axolotls in the study survived, and 3 gained weight, indicating that they were successfully hunting prey in their new home. The data also showed that the amphibians traveled farther early in the experiment, perhaps exploring before they found hunting and hiding spots. Reintroduction is really a plan B, said Luis Zambrano, an ecologist at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico in Mexico City. The researchers' main goal, Zambrano said, is to improve the aquatic habitat for axolotls already living in the wild. That's this week's Note on Emerging Science. I'm Don Lyman.
Halloween comes a day before the Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos, widely celebrated in Mexico. It's a yearly tradition for Living on Earth producer Paloma Beltran. And from her perch in Mexico City, she tells us how the celebration has taken on new meaning.
As October turns to November, thousands of candles are lighting up across the world, welcoming back the souls of family and loved ones who've passed away. The Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos in Spanish, is a holiday celebrated throughout Mexico and other parts of the Americas. The idea is that by setting up a colorful altar will attract and welcome the spirits of the departed back home. I know it may seem like an exceptional kind of reunion, but a lot of people across the world celebrate the departed in one way or another. I should clarify that I am no expert on Dia de los Muertos, and the specifics on what to incorporate vary across regions and family traditions. You know, that's just how culture works. But I would like to share a bit about what I learned throughout this year's planning process. Traditional altars are colorful, maximalist, and full of life. There are a few options. 2 levels representing heaven and earth, 3 levels representing heaven, purgatory, and earth, or the more elaborate 7 levels portraying different steps to heaven. Some historians link altars to the 9 stages needed to reach Mictlan, the underworld of Mexica mythology. Day of the Dead altars, or altares, can be dedicated to multiple family members, friends, mentors, basically anyone who's passed away and that you'd like to honor. There's even a Day of the Dead dedicated to pets on October 27th. When building the altar, you can go the eco-friendly route like I did and reuse cardboard boxes to set up the structure. It really doesn't have to be expensive. Altares represent a connection to the circle of life as well as the 4 elements of nature: water, wind, fire, and earth. A glass of water signifies purity. The light and delicate texture of papel picado, or perforated paper, represents wind and the fragility of life. Some say the holes in the tissue paper allow souls to travel and visit us. Fire is invoked by lit candles, which serve to light the path and guide the spirits of the deceased home. For earth, we offer seeds, fruits, and the dead's favorite foods, as well as beverages. If your loved one enjoyed fresh lemonade, for example, or a cold beer, make sure to place it in their altar, because who wouldn't want to be received with a cool drink first resin comes from a tree endemic to Mexico and Central America. It's found in the warm areas across the states of Michoacan, Chiapas, Oaxaca, Puebla, and more. Cempasúchil flowers or petals are usually placed at the bottom of the structures. The colorful orange and yellow petals, as well as a fragrant scent, once again are meant to attract the departed to the altar. This year's altar is especially significant for me and my partner since my father passed away recently. On my father's side, my family has been farming for generations.
Với Hành đổi gì con?
To honor my father's connection to the earth and agriculture, we're incorporating alfalfa, cotton flowers, and a bit of dirt from the fields he worked with and loved dearly. It's honestly been an opportunity to call up family and friends, cry and laugh as we shared anecdotes about all our loved ones who have passed. Like remembering how my grandfather loved garlic and would even eat it raw. We used to joke around and call him a vampire slayer. Or learning that my father had a perm in college during the 70s. Who would have thought? For us, it's been a healing experience. Dia de los Muertos is an invitation to cherish the joys of those who have passed away and what they loved about this earth. It's also an opportunity to host them once again in your home with intention and care. And by keeping them close in our memories, we ensure that they are never abandoned or forgotten.
That's Living on Earth's Paloma Beltran.
Living on Earth is produced by the World Media Foundation. Our crew includes Naomi Herrenberg, Beltran, Sophie Volker, and Yellow for Reasons. Wyatt Gognajic, Mark Chapman, Marcel Clever, Don Lyman, Shanta McLean, Nana Mohammed, Ainsley O'Neill, Sophia Vandalides, Jake Coley, Jake Rigo, Andrew Scarrett, Bella Smith, Taurus, and Elle Wilson.
Tom Tiger engineered our show. Allison Lierstein composed our themes. You can hear us anytime at LOE.org, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. And like us please on our Facebook page, Living on Earth. Find us on Instagram at Living on Earth Radio. And we always welcome your feedback at comments at LOE.org. I'm Jenny Doring.
And I'm Steve Kerber. Thanks for listening.
Funding for Living on Earth comes from you, our listeners, and from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, in association with its School for the Environment, developing the next generation of environmental leaders, and from the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, supporting strategic communications and collaboration in solving the world's most pressing environmental problems.
PRX.
Support comes from GenPro, a Houston-based home generator service providing power to homes during unexpected outages. More information at genpro.com or by calling 713-597-3521.
On last week's Wait, Alex Edelman explained he never picks up those social cues, saying it's time to go home.
But for me, the party starts when people are upset that I'm there.
I'm Peter Sagal. You'll never want this week's news quiz to end with special guest actor, influencer, and fashion icon Julia Fox. You're invited to an exclusive news quiz. That's Wait from NPR.
Wait, Don't Tell Me can be heard Saturdays and Sundays at 10 a.m. on News 88.7. Your NPR station, News 88.7 KUHF Houston, a service of the University of Houston. Get local and breaking news anytime at houstonpublicmedia.org. Listen to us on your favorite devices. Tell your smart speaker to play News 88.7.
Coming up on The Answer with me, Nikki Beatty, rock legend Bruce Springsteen and the actor playing him, Jeremy Allen White.
I knew that
đơn giản quá à.
the physical, natural swagger that comes with if you want to be a rock musician.
Oscar-winning British actor and artist Tilda Swinton on the exhibition in Amsterdam that celebrates her collaborations. And
Đợi đơn giản không? Luôn đi.
American filmmaker Catherine Bigelow on her hugely tense political thriller, A House of Dynamite. Also on the show, choreographer Shobna Jayasinghe on discovering dance through Indian cinema. The Argentinian bandoneon player Carlos Quilici talks tango. My conversation writer and showrunner Leonardo Fazzari about his new crime series, The Monster of Florence. All that and more coming up on the Arts Hour.
BBC News with Montgomery. British police have arrested 2 men after a mass stabbing attack on a train in eastern England. Police were called to Huntingdon Station in Cambridgeshire, where the train made an emergency stop. 10 people were taken to hospital, 9 with life-threatening injuries. Victims ran down the aisles to escape a man with a large knife. Ollie Foster, a passenger, describes the horror.
I put my hand on this chair, and like she's trying to push myself forward, and then I look at my hand and it's covered in blood, and then I look at the chair and there's blood all over the chair. So some of the guys that have run through said kind of alert and run, they were also being stabbed. So we ran to the end of the carriage, kind of pulled the emergency alarm, just trying to work out the barrier the doors, and then by the time I got to the end of the carriage I realised I was actually in the back of it. There was a girl, bless her, who was really in a bit of a state because the guy had actually tried to stab her, but one of the older guys was an absolute hero, blocked him with his head, and he's got this like gash, he had this gash on his head, and we kind of giving him like little jackets to keep the pressure on the blood.
BBC's Daniel Sanford has the latest on the investigation.
British Transport Police are saying that they have started working with counter-terrorism police and who are supporting the investigation at this stage, and that's quite an important part of the process. The counter-terrorism police will start helping another police force if there's a possibility that at some point down the line it may turn into a counter-terrorism investigation, but they don't take over that investigation until they're sure that it does have a terrorism motivation.
President Trump has threatened to take military action against Nigeria unless his government does more to protect Christians from attack by Islamist extremists. He accused the Nigerian government of allowing the killing of Christians. Nigeria has rejected the claim that Christians are disproportionately targeted by Islamists. Here's Peter Bowes.
Writing on Truth Social, President Trump presented Nigeria with an ultimatum. He said that if the country's government continued to allow the killing of Christians, the US would stop providing aid and may very well intervene militarily to completely wipe out those behind the mass killings. Mr. Trump said he'd instructed the US Department of War to prepare for possible action, saying it would be fast, vicious and sweet.
Egypt has formally opened its huge new archaeological museum with a spectacular ceremony featuring lasers and fireworks over the nearby pyramids. The president said the Grand Egyptian Museum marked a new chapter in the history of his ancient nation. Russian authorities say a Ukrainian drone attack has damaged infrastructure at Tuapse, an oil-exporting port in the Black Sea. Footage posted online showed a large fire and defense troops trying to shoot down incoming drones. BBC News. A fire at a shop in the northwestern Mexican city of Hermosillo has killed at least 20 people and injured a dozen others. The governor of Sonora State said the fire broke out after an explosion, though the authorities are ruling out any criminal motive. The former US President Barack Obama has made biting attacks on the Trump administration during campaign rallies for Democratic gubernatorial candidates in Virginia and New Jersey. He urged voters in upcoming elections to reject what he termed the lawlessness, recklessness, and craziness coming from the White House.
All the nonsense we see on the news every day, the over-the-top rhetoric, the fabricated conspiracies, the weird videos of a U.S. president with a crown on his head flying a fighter jet and dumping poop on protesting citizens. All of that is designed to distract you from the fact that your situation has not gotten better.
Mr. Obama also rebuked Republicans for failing to curb President Trump. The US and China have decided to set up military-to-military channels to de-escalate any problems that might arise in the future. The agreement was reached between the US Defense Secretary and his Chinese counterpart when they met in Malaysia. French anti-fraud authorities are investigating the Asian fast fashion giant Chuyến for selling what they describe as sex dolls with a childlike appearance. launched an internal inquiry. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the Arts Hour from the BBC World Service. I'm Nikki Beatty, bringing you a luxury lineup of esteemed guests and some cultural companionship with the finest global arts and culture conversation from across the BBC. Coming up, rock legend Bruce Springsteen and the actor playing him, Jeremy Allen White, talk about the new biopic Springsteen Deliver Me From Nowhere. Oscar-winning British actor and artist Tilda Swinton discusses an exhibition in Amsterdam that celebrates her creative collaborations. And another Oscar winner, American filmmaker Kathryn Bigelow, on her hugely tense political thriller, A House of Dynamite. Also on the show, choreographer Shobna Jayasingh on discovering dance through Indian cinema, and the Argentinian bandoneon player Carlos Quilici talks about tango. That's not all though. Later in the show, I'll be in conversation with Italian screenwriter and showrunner Leonardo Fazzulli about his latest crime series, The Monster of Florence. And here with me in the studio as our cultural critic this week, we welcome back Katie Puckrick. Before we go any further, do you have a cultural highlight that you'd like to recommend to the world, Katie?
Yes, I'm going to recommend Nena Cherry's wonderful memoir, 1,000 Threads. Now, I'm not deep into it yet, but I love Nena. People will know her music. She burst onto the scene in the 80s singing Buffalo Girl, Man Child. She did that very moving and deep duet with Youssou N'Dour called 7 Seconds. And she's so interesting because she's basically, her coming of age story is that she's this little punk girl in New York and London, but her mom is Swedish, her dad was from Sierra Leone, she was raised also by her stepfather, Don Cherry, the jazz trumpeter, and this is a memoir of the world, of a young woman making her creative life through music, through food, through culture, through people. I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, thank you for that recommendation. First then, set in the early 1980s New Jersey, the film Bruce Springsteen Deliver Me From Nowhere chronicles the rock legend's experiences working on his album Nebraska. Two-time Emmy-winning actor Jeremy Allen White, best known for his role as Carney in the excellent TV series The Bear, plays Bruce before he became known as The Boss. The film is based on the book by Warren Zane as well as Bruce's 2016 memoir, and it's directed by Scott Cooper. When the BBC's Scott Mills spoke to Bruce Springsteen and Jeremy Allen White, he asked Bruce whether he's a reserved and private person.
I'd say so.
Yeah.
Except for 3 hours.
I was going to say, I think you've said it before, where Bruce Springsteen, that's not you.
No, it's not. I'd like to be Bruce Springsteen, actually.
All the time.
But I only get to be him for 3 hours. And the film is about trying to figure out what to do with the other 21.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeremy, obviously we know Bruce, the incredible performer and musician. But getting into the mind of
Chị con chơi đó, con chơi game có con đây.
Bruce, the real person, how was that for you, the offstage Bruce?
You know, I think in the beginning it's very hard. I had to ask myself, what do I have in common with Bruce Springsteen? And that's a very difficult thing to do, or it was for me. But I think getting to know him and as Bruce shared some moments and feelings I think that he was having around that time, and it wasn't such a strain to sort of draw parallels in times, you know, in my own life and in periods I've had and struggles I've had and doubts I've had and anxieties and fears and all these things. And so I think my goal was just to sort of bring up those honest things in myself, bring them as close to the surface as I could, to be in service of Bruce's story, really.
Yeah, but the choices Jeremy made, you know, he was drawn to the psychology of the character. I mean, he worked from the internal out, which was really essential to making the picture work. Was you had to understand the person, you know, the film, and if you see it, it's not a replay of my career. It's not you got this, you won this. You know, it's really. I mean, when I watch it, I even get a sense of, well, I'm just watching a film about a guy, you know.
Do you?
Who, yeah.
Almost like it's not you.
30 tuổi.
Just to play some music.
Jeremy, can
Was it an immediate yes? I had to be cautious because, you know, I want to be sure I'm the right person. I very quickly addressed, you know, I told him, you know, I don't know how to sing and play the guitar. Are you sure you don't want somebody that can? And he said, no, you know, we can learn those things. I think you have some. Bruce had seen, I think, my work on The Bear, and I said, well, let's give it a shot.
And the thing, what I saw on The Bear was that Jeremy had this complex inner life, and I knew that the film was going to rise or fall on the camera being able to read that from the main actor and interpret it, you know. And I'd seen him on the show, and I knew that the capturing of the psychology was going to be the main thing. And also Jeremy had a certain physical presence and a physical movement, natural swagger that comes with if you want to be a rock musician. And so right from the top, it was the first name I mentioned to Scott to play the part.
Bruce, how much persuasion did it take for this movie to happen?
Not that much, because I'm old, so you do get a lot freer with your choices as you get older. So I said, hey, let's give it a shot.
Bruce Springsteen and Jeremy Allen White on the film Springsteen Delivered Me From Nowhere. Our cultural critic on this edition of The Arts Hour is Katie Puckrick. Are you, first of all, a Springsteen fan, Katie?
I am. I grew up with Bruce Springsteen just blasting out of the car radio. Born to Run. I remember that just being such an exhilarating soundtrack. Riding along in the passenger seat as I would have been as a young teenager in the 70s. But
lái lẹ đi giao hàng đi cơm một nàng trưa nè.
Something so gosh darn American about him in all the best senses of that implication.
So thoughts on the film?
Ông lái ra đủ.
Deliver me from what is it called? Nowhere. Deliver me from nowhere. I was delivered from ignorance because I went in.
Lái xong ông lái.
Oh, is this just going to be another gratuitous biopic about an interesting person we already know way too much about? Well, I didn't know anything about his struggles with depression, and I didn't know that he'd had such a terrible childhood with his dad, who was deeply troubled and very limited as a guardian. And Bruce suffered abuse and then had to channel it through his music, but at the point that it was screwing up his private life and indeed his equilibrium, he had to deal with it. And it's actually a very beautifully depicted account of somebody grappling with their demons.
And do you feel that biopics are in fact more successful if they have a sharp focus, so they cover just a period of time, a bit like A Complete Unknown focused on Bob Dylan going electric, for example? How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, yes, it does help if they just zero in on a less explored aspect of somebody's life, but also you can do compelling things in how you tell the story. So I'm thinking about I, Tonya, which was about the Olympic figure skater Tonya Harding and her involvement of her attack on her rival Nancy Kerrigan. And that was when they broke the fourth wall and they discussed what they were going through directly with us, the viewers. So I think, I mean, and yes, that is an aspect of their life. But also I'm thinking about The Wolf of Wall Street, which was based on, that was the Martin Scorsese film, based on the stockbroker who was just basically defrauding anyone he came in contact with to great effect. And that was a biopic that exaggerated, perhaps, I hope, the extent of the hubris and the hedonism and the excesses. So I think whenever you go to excess is when a biopic is successful.
Thank you so much. You're listening to The Arts Hour from the BBC World Service. I'm Nikki Beattie. Rather than a biopic, British actor and artist Tilda Swinton's work is being celebrated in a new exhibition which has just opened in Amsterdam. Tilda Swinton's career has spanned 4 decades and she's delivered unforgettable performances in Orlando, The Chronicles of Narnia, Michael Clayton, for which she won her Oscar, The Grand Budapest Hotel, and she's worked with Oscar-winning filmmakers as different as Korean director Bong Joon-ho and Spanish auteur Pedro Almodovar. The exhibition is called Tilda Swinton Ongoing and explores her life's work not just as a solo artist, but celebrates her creative relationships with filmmakers like Derek Jarman, Joanna Hogg, Jim Jarmusch, and others, built on trust, curiosity, and shared imagination. The BBC's Anita Rani asked Tilda Swinton how she felt about being the focus of an exhibition.
They asked me 5 years ago, and I quite quickly said no. The Eye Museum, for those who don't know, is an extraordinary cinema museum in Amsterdam, and I'd been there for years seeing exhibitions devoted to my most hallowed filmmakers, and I couldn't imagine what an exhibition devoted to my work would be, except something rather boring and retrospective and dead. I couldn't help thinking about old clips of old films and old posters and old photographs and old costumes. I couldn't think of anything that would interest me. And then slowly, well, they kept very patiently asking me again, and I kept updating the software. And one day I asked myself, okay, so what would be useful? How could a show dedicated to your 40 years of work be useful? And I started to reflect on what I might be able to offer, particularly younger generations. And the thing that I feel I kind of stand for is fellowship. I've worked for 40 years now in long-term relationships with not only a handful, but quite a lot of people who want to work in this way. Of course, I started with Derek Jarman in the 80s and started to work in a collective way. And when he died of AIDS in '94, I was really stuck. I thought, well, that's over. I can't work in film anymore because nobody else is going to want to work in this way. And the miracle is I found other families, and for 40 years I've gone on working. So I thought of this title, I thought of ongoing. Also thought what a good word it is to have on posters around cities around the world.
Yes.
Publicising this show.
A good mission statement as well.
Yeah, we need to remember that ongoing is ahead of us. You know, it's not, or rather it's with us. We're absorbing all the time ideas of endings, but ongoing is the thing.
Tell us about the exhibition. What can people see?
I asked the museum, and for them to say yes to this was not nothing. I said, I don't want there to be anything finished. I want it all to be new work. And so I've commissioned 8 of my collaborators to make new work. There's a new film that I made with Abichapu Etsetical, my friend Joe from Thailand. A new piece of work with Joanna Hogg, which in fact is an installation of my first flat in London. There's a new set of portraits with Tim Walker, and a new performance with Olivier Sayar, who I do performances around costume with. And even Derek Jarman, who's the only one, of course, who's very sadly no longer with us, I've even found new work from him. The first 2 screens of the exhibition carry images that no one's ever seen before. At Dungeonettes, taken from Dungeonettes, 1986. Super 8 footage of me playing around in the pebbles in Newbell.
How do you choose who to collaborate with?
You know, the title of the show is Ongoing. It is about ongoing relationships. You know, I had this vision in my mind of the relationship being the most important thing. That's the trunk of the tree. The conversation you're having at the time is the branch. And the film or the book or the performance or whatever it is, it's just the leaf. It's not that important. And it seems to me that's a relatively unusual approach. We're always encouraged, particularly young artists, are encouraged to think of the product.
Yeah.
How are you going to produce this thing? What's it going to be when it's finished? But that's not real. What's real is our life's work and practice making the thing. And you always, if you're making films, make it in a group. It's not a solo task. And so it's really about companionship, conversation, and an ongoing developing life.
Actor and artist Tilda Swinton. I am a massive fan of her work on screen. Our cultural critic on this edition of the Arts Hour is Katie Puckrick. What is it, do you think, Katie, about Tilda that makes her so interesting to filmmakers?
Well, first of all, there's her exquisitely alien-esque beauty. She doesn't look like anybody else on planet Earth. She is always her own person, and weirdly, that should hold her back, because it's not like she exactly disappears into a role. You always know it's Tilda Swinton, but there's something also really cool about her. Not thermally. She might be chilly, but she's sort of hip, so she kind of makes any production she's involved involved with seem a little more intelligent and got it going on. But there's also, she has an austere elegance, but also she's playful, and you know she's game. She's up for it. And so I think that's what makes directors and any collaborator want to work with her.
You nailed it. Do you have any creative collaborations in mind with her that stand out for you? Is there anything in particular?
Well, in addition to this exhibition that she's involved in, I know she did something where she was sleeping in a glass box in a museum a few years ago, so people could just sort of see her in repose, unconscious. And also I'm thinking about a collaboration she did with a perfume company. This happened probably around 2010, thereabouts. And she made a portrait of herself, an olfactory portrait in perfume. And the portrait was brought forth through notes such as ginger, because she has red hair, pumpkin, because she was born in November, and that's an autumn vegetable. There's also whiskey in there because she lives in Scotland. There's the smell of kind of salty corn chips because that's the smell of dog paws, and she loves dogs. And there's sandalwood. It sounds unwearable, but it's actually a very lovely, beautiful perfume. And she has a curiosity that leads her to these very provocative and tangy and beautiful collaborations.
Wow. We need to let our listener know that you are in fact an expert on perfume.
Yes, I write about perfume, I talk about perfume, and I have a lot of videos on YouTube where I discuss perfume. So it's an interest of me because I like stimulation. I'm a savorer, as you know.
I love that. Thank you, Katie. You're with the Art Hour, and I'm Nikki Beatty. The pioneering British choreographer Shobna Jayasingh has produced more than 60 original works, many of them created for performance outdoors or in unusual settings. Born in India, she's lived in Sri Lanka and Malaysia growing up, and came to England in her late teens to study at university. She learned Indian classical dance as a child, and in her early 20s, she drew on that passion first as a dancer, and then founded her own dance company in 1989 to develop her own work. Since then, she's collaborated with scientists, filmmakers, and numerous composers. The BBC's Michael Bartley asked Shobna about her education and whether she enjoyed reading as a child.
Yes, I loved reading actually my mother was a maths teacher, and I think she was a bit disappointed that actually words seemed to inspire me far more than numbers. She got her maths degree when she was 19, so she must have been obviously very good at it. When I was young, I just found myself reading all kinds of books, books in Tamil, books in English. I had an unusual library as a child because I grew up in what's called upcountry Sri Lanka, where all the tea estates are. And most of the tea estates actually were managed by Scottish people, because they were the huge colonial administrators. So all the tea estates and Scottish names like Dunbar, Glasgow, Murray. And so one of my father's friends, who was a Scottish planter, he gave me his son's entire library when they finally left Sri Lanka. I was reading as if I were actually living somewhere in Edinburgh, because I just had this child's books to read, which none of my Sri Lankan friends did.
And was music important to your early life? Was it there at school? Did you learn an instrument?
Well, I learned the piano, but I also listened to a lot of Indian classical music because I did Indian classical dance. It was a brilliant school because it had dance in its curriculum. So every week, apart from language and maths and other stuff, we also had a dance lesson. We learned folk dance, we had Sri Lankan Kandyan dance, and then privately I learned Bharatanatyam, which is a South Indian classical dance. So I grew up listening to both types of music. We sang, it was a very Christian school, so we sang hymns 3 times a day. So I kind of grew up with these two musical languages in my head.
So the first style of dancing that you were involved in was what?
South Indian classical dance, which is called Bharatanatyam, from age of 6. It uses every part of the body, neck, fingers, because obviously when you think